Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of Jacksonian America, where we're going to be talking about the bank war. Our two questions to think about here: why does Andrew Jackson oppose the Bank of the United States, or the BUS, and what happened in the bank war? Before we begin, I want to remind you of some of the background information we've already talked about. Alexander Hamilton created the Bank of the United States in 1791. It was given a 20-year charter, but in 1811, Congress decided not to renew that charter, so the first Bank of the United States expired. The economy immediately took a hit, so in 1816, Congress made the decision to recreate the Bank of the United States, and they called it the Second Bank of the United States. It was also given a 20-year charter. So that's where we're coming on the scene here with President Jackson. And then what happened in the bank war? Here's that story. Andrew Jackson is what we might call an old school Jeffersonian Democratic Republican. And what that means is he's going to take a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. And Jackson hates the bank. There's a backstory here that we're not really going into. Jackson just generally hated banks. He was concerned about their authority and the control over the money. But when it came to the Bank of the United States, Jackson's biggest concern was he believed it wasn't constitutional. He believed that the Bank of the United States was an overextension of the powers of the federal government. Now, the other problem is President Jackson is arrogant. He believes that most people agree with him. But in reality, most people had found the Bank of the United States to be a stabilizing force in the American economy. But Jackson is a pretty powerful persona, and he is the President of the United States. So the man pictured here on this slide is Nicholas Biddle. He was the president of the BUS at the time. And he had been listening to many of Andrew Jackson's opponents, like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. These men hated Jackson. And they have convinced Nicholas Biddle that President Jackson is going to destroy the Bank of the United States. So Nicholas Biddle is concerned enough that he is going to ask Congress to recharter the Bank of the United States early. So in 1832, rather than waiting until 1836. What happens is Congress makes the decision. They pass the renewal of the Bank of the United States with flying colors. But when that bill reaches Jackson's desk, he vetoes it. This issue has now become a campaign issue in the presidential election of 1832. This is really exactly what Henry Clay wanted. Henry Clay pictured on the far left of this slide, Andrew Jackson in the middle. So what happens in this election is that Andrew Jackson wins this election handily. Take a look at the map and the pie chart for the Electoral College vote. Jackson wins 77% of the Electoral College vote. That's a really healthy margin. So Andrew Jackson takes this as a sign that the people agree with him. I mean, why else would they have reelected him by such a healthy margin if they didn't agree with his views? So President Jackson is going to take his victory in the election of 1832 as a sign that the people also hate the Bank of the United States and that they want it to die. Congress is going to be working on trying to override the president's veto. But in the meantime, President Jackson isn't going to just sit around and wait for the Bank of the United States to die. he is going to kill it. Notice the quote here on the slide. Andrew Jackson is speaking to his new vice president, Martin Van Buren, where he says, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." So the way that Andrew Jackson's going to do this is one of the biggest depositors in the Bank of the United States is the U.S. government. So every time the U.S. government collected taxes, it put that money in the bus. It's part of the reason why the bus was created. This gives the bus the ability to loan out that money and then make money on the interest from those loans. But if the U.S. government removes its deposits, then the bus won't have the ability to make new loans because it doesn't have any money to loan out. Thus, the Bank of the United States would die early. Andrew Jackson is going to go to his Secretary of the Treasury and order him to withdraw U.S. funds from the Bank of the United States. But the problem is, his Secretary of the Treasury says no and resigns. The reason is the law that created the Bank of the United States said this is going to be the bank where the U.S. government is going to keep its money. So the Secretary of the Treasury is arguing that by removing the funds, he would be violating the law. So he resigns instead. Andrew Jackson is undeterred. He is going to go to a new Secretary of the Treasury and order him to remove the deposits from the bus. He also says no and resigns. Undeterred, because we're talking about Andrew Jackson here, he has a new Secretary of the Treasury, and this is Roger B. Taney. I want you to put a little star next to this guy's name because in a little while, he's going to pop up again in kind of a weird position. So just remember that name for the moment. When Andrew Jackson makes Roger B. Taney the Secretary of the Treasury, Taney does what President Jackson has ordered, and he removes the money from the Bank of the United States. He takes that money and puts it in 23 state banks that are nicknamed pet banks because these banks are owned and controlled by Jackson's supporters. So all of a sudden, these smaller banks are flush with money. They have lots and lots of money, which means they can make a lot of loans to lots of people and then earn lots of interest on those loans. But the problem is they weren't terribly particular about who they were giving loans to. It's like they didn't even care, do you have a job? No, we're just going to give you a loan. Of course, these people can't pay it back, which means this is a bad financial decision. To make matters worse, Nicholas Biddle goes on the attack. He is going to order the Bank of the United States to call in all outstanding loans, which means if you've missed a loan payment or if you're behind in your payments, the bank can say your entire balance is now due. So think about your car loan if you have one. You make your monthly payments and that's manageable. But what if the bank came to you and said, your entire loan is due today? I don't have that kind of money. So they would have to take my car or my land or whatever that I had taken a loan out for. And that's what the bus is doing. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is going to crash the economy. Nicholas Biddle knows this. In fact, this is why he does it. Nicholas Biddle is going to call in all of these outstanding loans because he knows it's going to crash the economy. And who looks bad when there's a bad economy? The President of the United States. In the end, the Bank of the United States would never be rechartered. And part of the reason why we don't have a Bank of the United States today is because of Andrew Jackson. So going back to our questions to think about, why does Andrew Jackson oppose the Bank of the United States? It's because he believes it's unconstitutional. He believes that it is an overextension of the power of the federal government. So what happened in the bank war is that Andrew Jackson is going to remove the deposits of the United States from the Bank of the United States, which constitutionally is questionable. Like, is that legal? ? And in the end, the economy crashes, the Bank of the United States dies, and Andrew Jackson believes that he has won this great victory. But as we're about to see in part 3, there's going to be a backlash against Jackson because of the bank war.